and then also to work out credit arrangements and get international banking. So the Cuban government is trying to do an awful lot of things in a very short period of time. And that puts a great deal of pressure on them, and sometimes a great deal of pressure on us as well, as they negotiate commercial deals, putting politics very much into the commercial part of it, which can make for very difficult negotiations.
And also, sometimes you have to be careful what you wish for. When we first started dealing with Cuba, one of the things was that you know, they were in a terrorist list. That they, a lot of the regulations that were taken off, that people could not travel to the island and everything, have right now been softened. Basically, the embargo has been, I would say, quite, it's a shell. It's not as strong as it used to be. And, you know, there are more trade going on. But Cuba, on the other hand, with all the opportunities, because before you had agricultural goods, now you also have construction materials, is taking a back step and going, well, let me see. And that could also backfire on them, because companies, to an extent, or people can say, well, you know, it gets tiring indirectly. So sometimes you have to be careful what you wish for. And I say, in the case of Cuba, I think that they were always in the role where they were more of a victim, playing a victim. Is, you know, it's all the U.S. fault, the U.S. fault. The U.S. came and changed, and now they have to react, and they are taking their time reacting, and sometimes the steps that they're taking is not what we in the business community really are looking for.
And I think some other things that are important, and we spent an awful lot of time going over this, and perhaps something to be learned from the whole U.S.-Cuban relationship is, how did we get into this kind of relationship anyhow? And this becomes important, I think, as we're dealing forward in Cuba, understanding that we're still not the very best of friends. There's a lot of suspicion that still exists on both sides. There's still some very strong emotions on both sides. And there's historical reason for a lot of this. And we spend some time going into that, interestingly enough, going back to the to the U.S. Revolution, when at the Battle of Yorktown, the money was needed in order to finance the French fleet. That money came from Cuba. It was Spanish Cuba at the time. And obviously, at the Cuban Revolution, the Spanish-American War, the U.S. was very involved with that. So we've been involved in each other's independence movements from the very beginning of both nations. We have also had a conflictive relationship between the two countries almost from the very beginning, with the U.S. to a degree feeling and actually having made offers to buy Cuba under the Jefferson administration, under the Adams administration, and right before the Civil War, an even stronger movement, but it was decided not to do that because they didn't want to bring another slave state into the Union during the time approaching the Civil War situation. So there's, on the one hand, there's been this sort of feeling, well, the U.S. kind of certainly controls Cuba, and Cuba's reaction, well, no, you don't really. And that underlines a lot of what's going on and shouldn't be ignored, because those kinds of relationships exist today. It's one where you will see Cuba continually insisting on mutual respect, that they are treated as equals as they go into these negotiations, and perhaps sometimes trying to overcompensate for that. So as Mari said, it's a complicated relationship, one that is kind of moving forward, and we're sure that we're going to see it move backward as well as forward as both countries adjust to where they feel most comfortable. And perhaps one thing that underlines this was in the meetings in Panama at the Organization of American States between President Obama and President Castro, with President Obama basically saying, look, I don't really know what happened in relation to Cuba, but it'll happen before I was born. So I guess it's not important. And then President Castro saying, well, wait a minute, sorry it happened before you were born, but it is kind of important because we from the Cuban side feel that, well, maybe you still have some land that belongs to us in Cuba that we might like to have back. We have suffered from this embargo. We want to talk about that. And we understand what you're saying about human rights. We don't necessarily agree with you with, yes, we should open up the entire country to all telecommunications right now, and we don't agree necessarily with you on the approach to human rights. So there are a number of different philosophies that still have to be approached and little by little resolved, and it doesn't happen all at once.
But one thing that's important in the equation is to look at the Cuban Americans. And for myself, and I see Maria Antonia there, our life was basically turned around. My family went to the Bahamas, yours went to Guatemala. We ended up in a boarding school, and it was like we lost the security of a home. Then you're looking at Cuban Americans here who still have that pain that they lost. They had to leave the country from one day to the next. I remember my mom, she had 4 children, and she was pregnant with her 5th, and she had to leave everything behind. So those heridas, which we call in Spanish, have not healed completely. It is time to move on, but the Cuban Americans here in Florida, in the US, in the world, also have to come to terms and realize that the embargo did not achieve what they wanted it to achieve. So we have to move on and look at other venues. And trade and commerce has changed to an extent. It still remains a communist country. China is Vietnam. But if we can trade with those countries, why can we not change and do trade with Cuba? Now, the difference is when you go to Cuba, the Cuban people are anxious with contact with Americans, the clothes, the food. They're very open and friendly to the U.S. They have a phrase that I love, no es fácil, it is not easy. And every time you have a roadblock, we go and say, no es fácil. And that is the truth. Also, when you look at our history, you have to take into account that in between the time that Columbus landed in Cuba till the time that Castro came into power, you basically had only 26 years of what you call democracy, elected governments. You also had where the U.S. controlled a lot of our say, and you had the mafia. So when you look at the revolution, it came as a nationalistic. There was a lot of nationalistic feelings in the Cuban people that they were going to be liberated and finally have a democratic type of government. That did not happen. But again, if you read History Will Absolve Me, La Historia Me Absolverá, you would see that Castro wrote what he was going to do even before the revolution came about. So it's complex, but I still think that Cuba is evolving. I do agree with the saying that they say in Cuba, Cuba es de los cubanos. Cuba is a problem that the Cuban people have to solve, whether here or abroad. One thing that I do disagree with what the Obama administration has done is that they have not brought other Cuban groups from the island into the negotiation. Also, at the beginning of the independence, when you had that Treaty of Paris, el Tratado de París, the Mambises were not allowed to participate in that treaty. So historically, the Cuban people have been alienating from determining their own self-determination. Right now, you're talking the one sector with the U.S. Back then, it was the U.S. with Spain. But the Cuban people are the ones that really need to start taking a hold and determining what the evolution of their government will be. Whether it be a democracy, there is no to democracy. Whether it be some type of socialism, but I truly believe that we have an opportunity to contribute, and to contribute in a positive way. And I think that's one of the tools that we should apply and start utilizing. How the Cubans here can work positively.
And I think picking up on that, one of the chapters in the book is called Patience, Passion, and Persistence, which really becomes important, I think, as we all deal more and more with Cuba. I remember sitting at a meeting in the Ministerio de Relaciones Exteriores and saying, wow, we keep asking for this and we keep talking about this. And the director turned to me and she said, Brickman, because in Cuba it's very often to use last names as opposed to first names. And she said, Brickman, tú todavía no has aprendido paciencia. You still haven't learned any patience? And it becomes really important because there's a lot to be unwound and resolved yet. And if you don't have a patience to go through that process, and you don't have a passion that you want to make it happen, and not just from the point of view of, well, maybe I'll be able to sell 3 more chickens or something, but it's a lot bigger than that, that you want a relationship to be formed between the two countries. If you don't have that passion, and you don't have the patience, and lastly, if you don't have the persistence, understanding full well, the first meeting's not going to go the way you want it to, and the second meeting's not going to go the way you want it to, and the third meeting isn't, but if you really have the patience and passion, then you'll be persistent on it. Mm-hmm. And that becomes really important as we move into this new diplomatic and commercial relationship between the two countries.
I also think it's very important that, and this has been what I call our win-win formula, is that we have been transparent. And you have to be transparent if you're going to deal with the Cuban government. They might not like, or you might not like what they have, but you have to maintain a transparency. And I truly believe that that is what has maintained us since back in the 1998 was when we went to the to the Cuban embassy in Mexico City. Till now has maintained us with a relationship that has been of mutual respect. We disagree and agree to disagree, but I think that they listen. And also in my as a Cuban American, I always told the Cuban government that I would be going, and I was notorious for going to all Havana, sitting down and talking to the people. As a matter of fact, in the book, there is a chapter which is very interesting. There was one of the colleagues of Jay from Crawley who was married to a Cuban, and they had brainwashed it that there was nothing to eat in Cuba, that they didn't have anything. So we're in the middle of Camagüey. It was 10 in the evening, and I said, well, pick any house. And we knocked at a house, and I said, look, I have this American. here that thinks that you don't have anything to eat, no TV, no nothing, and they're looking at us, and they're saying, this is a wild, mad woman. Well, the interesting part was that I said, can we look at your refrigerator? And the lady said, what do you mean, you're looking at my refrigerator? Well, I opened up the freezer, and there was a huge bag of Tyson chicken. Well, Lord and behold, your colleague said, those are the chickens that come on Crowley, on the container, on the vessel. And we sat down, we had coffee, we talked, and we said, but transparency is it's very important. I think it's very important.
And to sort of underline this, if you can imagine, here it is, 10 o'clock at night in Camagüey, and these 10 people come, and we all come on bicycle taxis. So where you have 2 people sitting up front and then somebody doing the propulsion of the taxi. So these people look out their door and they see these 10 people on these bicycles going, what in the world?
And they were all gringos.
And they were all gringos with one exception. So, and the first question was not, can we see your refrigerator? The first question was, do you have a refrigerator? And so the lady was even more astounded, but we survived.
But there are a lot of misconceptions about Cuba, and the Cuban people are one of the warmest, most welcoming, most hospitable, putting aside any governmental differences. I'm talking the people from I mean, you just stop them in the street. You can go to any neighborhood, you can go to any city, and they always have a smile. They will share what they don't even have with you. And that's one of the reasons that I strongly believe that we do need to change in our policy. And I shouldn't say this, but I've never been a fan of Obama, but I do like his policy in Cuba. I mean, Jane, I'm known as a conservative diehard, but I do applaud his policy. I think he did a positive step there.
Can you imagine how hard it was to write this book? There are probably some other things, and not to delay this too long, because certainly I think the more important part is that we all just chat about it together. One of the chapters, and it's sort of like in a restaurant, well, what do you have good today? And they say, well, everything. So all the chapters are good. But I think another chapter that perhaps is of some interest is one that's a little bit controversial, and we have somebody, the former mayor of Coral Gables, Mr. Valdez Rauli, who's here and makes me a little nervous because he knows a lot more about this than I do. But as we went into why the relationship got the way it is, and I think it really is instructive because it showed how U.S. foreign policy first was a response to this, probably this somewhat of an attitude of I own you, no you don't, and with even starting with the Eisenhower administration saying to Fidel Castro when he came to the U.S., well, I'm not really going to receive you. Why don't you talk to my vice president who hates communists? And that started off as a really not good basis for a relationship. After that, then as Cuba became allied with the Soviet Union, it was, well, the friend of our enemy, it has to be our enemy, and therefore a lot of the relationship went along with, because we have this animosity with the Soviet Union, we have the same problem with Cuba. That changed with the decline and ultimate dissolution of the Soviet Union, at which time logic might say, well, okay, why didn't relationships at that time then change? And that's where I think it becomes really fascinating to understand some of the politics in the U.S. And it's not a criticism, but a commentary on how a reasonably small group of people, if they have some economic wherewithal and they have the passion to promote a particular cause, how effective they can be within the U.S. government's foreign policy mechanism. And this has an awful lot to do with why it has taken as long as it has to get the relationship somewhat adjusted, and we're still obviously in the process of doing that between the U.S. and Cuba. And maybe we want to talk a little bit about after the euphoria.
Yeah, we do. But I also want to say that the book, for those of you that have not read it or are going to read it, is a dialogue. So it's a dialogue between Jay and myself. Sometimes it's funny, some of the things that happens to us. Sometimes it's controversial. But it's our experiences of what we had experienced in Cuba for the past, 12, 13 years? 13 years. Your first sailing was 2001.
Yeah.
This is something that is very interesting. And I'm just going to talk about it before we get to the euphoria, because I think that it is relevant. The first sailing from Crawley was leaving Jacksonville. At that time, I was employed at the Jacksonville Port Authority. Well, I'm waiting for everything, and I get a message from someone in your office that the ship was being turned back. Now, the ship was being turned back because our own government, whether deliberately or playing around, put a cargo that was not supposed to be going to Cuba. Immediately, we called the Cuban intersection, and they flew to Jacksonville, sat down with Crawley, and talked about why the ship was turned around and everything. They never said, well, we're not going to have another vessel or anything. After the problem was solved, the ship started going regularly. The sad part about it all was that our government, or my government, because like I said, I'm a conservative Republican and you had a Republican in the administration, had put the wrong cargo, and the Cubans were the ones that came and solved the problems for us. So it's interesting to see how when governments want to work together, they can work together.
There's something a little bit anecdotal about this. We were literally standing on the docks in Havana waiting for the ship to come in. And our agent, a gentleman by the name of Jorge Pascual, he's like 6'6" or so, and he came up and he said, we have to go to a meeting. And I looked at him, and Jorge was completely just pale. And I'm going, what's wrong? And he said, well, there's nothing wrong. I said, Jorge, why are you white? Why are you so white? And he said, everything's fine. We just need to go to a meeting. And I said, okay, well then we'll go to a meeting. And we went to the meeting at Mendez, who is the agency for all vessels coming into Cuba. And can I mention Eduardo Denise? I just did.
You did.
Eduardo Denise, who was in charge of Mendez, said, well, I have instructions to read you the following. And then he said, until we have a mutual relationship between the United States and Cuba, we have decided that U.S. vessels, or vessels from the U.S. cannot dock in Cuba. And I said, well, Eduardo, we've been working on this for the last 15 years. I think I'm probably going to have to explain to Tom Crowley what's happened here. Can I get a copy of what you've just read me? And he said, no. And I said, well, could I copy it down so I could tell Tom Crowley what's happening to us? And he said, if you can write really fast. And something else that now that Mari's mentioned that comes out of it, it goes back to the patient's passion and persistence and a little bit of sensitivity. Within the Crowley organization, the question was, well, what do we do? And Tom Crowley was very, very clear on that. He said, we don't do anything. It's not the first time that we didn't call on a port that we planned to call on, not the last time we haven't called on a port that we planned to call on, and we just continue operations as we always have. As all of us get more and more involved in business relationships with Cuba, I'm sure there are going to be some things that are not going to work the way we want to, and probably, as we mentioned in another one of the chapters, which is called Pollos in Politics, Chickens in Politics, that it's really important probably to count to 10, stop and think about it, count to 10 again, start all over. Having a really strong emotional relationship or reaction normally is not going to help either side move along in the relationship.
And another thing before we get to the other chapter, which was very interesting. I was not in Alabama as I am now. I was still in Jacksonville. The largest delegation from Florida went to Cuba, which was surprisingly. It was one of the first times that I came face to face with Fidel Castro, and we had to go to a dinner. I got sick, I got a headache, I started throwing up. I walked out of the dinner. I felt I was betraying everything my family had taught me and left. So I walked out of the dinner. I was the only person that I think I walked out of Fidel Castro and a dinner. The next morning, they're knocking on my door, and they said, he's suspecting you for lunch with the group. So he was talking for about, I don't know how many, an hour to close to that. And I told him, with all due respect, you stand corrected. And I was one of the few persons that got away correcting Castro when he was talking about that Cuba had a lot of rum and tobacco to export. And I said, you stand corrected. You have nickel, you have zinc, you have the pink marble and all the stuff. And he says, well, at least I was corrected by a pretty Cuban lady. I mean, it was, and those are things that happened to us down there that I know my mom is shaking her head, but it was true. but it was true. Now, when you look at after the euphoria, and this is something that is very worrisome, I think both to Jay and myself, a lot of people think that they can now go to Cuba and set up shop. That is not going to happen. It's a complicated, long process. First, you have to go to D.C. You have to be vetted by the Cuban embassy. Then they have to give you a visa. Then you have to go to Cuba. Then you're lucky if you meet the right person. In the meantime, it's ching, 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 because you're spending tremendous amount of money and you're not going to see anything. You have to be, one, willing to expend a lot of money. Two, you have to do it right. And it's not going to happen the first or second or third time. And we got to hear a customer, Marcela, with Gulf South Forest Products, and she goes every year, hoping that this is the year that they'll buy lumber or forest products again. But it's building that relationship and going through a very frustrating way of doing business. So what's going to happen to those businesses that get so frustrated that just walk away because of what's going on, and they don't realize that it is a rigorous process, and it could take you not 1, 2, but maybe 3, 4 years for you to see the first fruits.
Yeah, I think something that underlines this, in talking with a Cuban official about waiting for some answers, and a lot of American companies have gone through this, that they make their presentations, they show what they want to do, and then they wait and wait and wait for a response. In a more recent context, we were talking about this, and one Cuban official said, well, you understand, one, we're under a tremendous amount of pressure, we have to do this right, and we cannot make a mistake. And I turned to him and I said, but we all make mistakes. And his response was, we don't have that luxury. And so part of the frustration of, as we're breaking this new mold to go into a new relationship is, certainly from the Cuban side, they still have a tremendous amount of suspicion about what is it that you really want to do. They're not necessarily sure of the marching orders they have from their own government, and they're very, very concerned that somehow they violate something they shouldn't. And I think as we move away from the euphoria, because if you were to read and certainly you can see it in the New York Times and to a degree in the Miami Herald and so on, that everything is good, that all the relationships have opened, that it's ready to do business, and it's just a question of you found the pot at the end of the rainbow. There's no question there will be a number of opportunities which I think can be very important for all of us. But as Mari just said, it's not going to happen, and it's not a question of a month or 2 months. It could be a question of a year or 2 years before you really get to the position that you want to get, that the political and the economic climate permits what you want to happen. So again, really important that you understand there is opportunity, and no, it's not necessarily going to be easy. So the no es fácil comes out even more so. And as we get away from this euphoria of what we're seeing right now, we'll get into the really hard negotiations of, well, I want to do this and you want to do that, and this is what it's going to cost, but this is what I'm going to pay. And then that's where the real test comes as to how serious and how persistent you're going to be in going after a business.
And one thing that is very interesting in all of this is that here you're sending emails, you're calling, you're leaving messages, and you go, no one is getting back to me. Yet, if the Cubans want to get a hold of you, it has to be immediate right now and put everything down. So you have to understand that. But you also have to use humor. The other day I couldn't get hold of the commercial attaché, so I texted him and I said in Spanish, no muerdo, llámame. I do not buy, please call me, because we had some questions about some poultry shipments, and lo and behold, immediately he was calling. So, if you're expecting them to react the same way you're accustomed to reacting here, it's not going to happen. It takes a lot of, a tremendous amount of patience, a tremendous amount of biting your tongue, and also good humor. I mean, they, believe it or not, they do have good, a sense of humor. And you also have to understand that a lot of people that you deal with have grown up on that system, were younger than myself, so and that's their job. That's they put the food in the table for their family. So they are very careful to maintain that, and I'm glad to see Alexis there, who used to be the head of the ports in Cuba, and he came here and he understands what I'm talking about. It's a tremendous amount of patience and energy. I think that we should open up for questions.
Absolutely, yes.
Carlos.
I was fascinated by a lot of the history that you described in your early comments. History is important. As Pope Francis yesterday in one of his great speeches that he's been giving both in Cuba and in the U.S. The last 8 or 9 days, said you have to move ahead, but use history to understand what happened so that you don't make the same mistake again. And so, but one part that I did not hear you mention, I'd like to know your perspective on it, is the Cuban government right now outwardly very strongly, Raul Castro said it yesterday in the UN, wants the U.S. to compensate them for the damage done by the embargo, but I don't hear anybody, either them or the U.S., talking about compensation for all of the losses that the U.S. had in Cuba. Can you make some comment about that?
You're going to hear the Cuban government, and they have said it, Josefina Vidal, Raúl Castro, el embajador Cabañas, they're going to be inflexible. They have come out and said that. They have a window of opportunity, and they think that prior to an election year, they're trying to see how much they can do. I'm a true believer, and if you ask me, you had a Russian Revolution, you had a French Revolution, you had a civil war in this country. There are winners and losers. If you lost your property, if you lost, you have to accept that and you have to move on. If all the Russians during the Russian Revolution were compensated for what they lost, all the during the French Revolution, you just have to move on. Both sides, the U.S. side and the Cuban side. I think you have to start from scratch. Borrón y cuenta nueva. That's my opinion. Jay?
I think, going back to history a little bit, in 1959, when the confiscation of the various, and I think you have to separate this a little bit between what was U.S.-owned property at the time of the revolution and subsequently what happened with people who ultimately left Cuba and had their property confiscated from them. And that was done to Cuban citizens by a Cuban government. And so they're two different categories.
Yeah, definitely. And I'm talking about the first one.
Okay.
I'm thinking of the first one. Not
registered claims.
well, I'm not sure technically what to call them. I'm talking, let me give you an example. Cuba was probably the most developed of all the Latin American countries at that time. That was as a result of investment of U.S. money in Cuba over many years. You know, the electrification of the island, the telephone systems, all of that were built with U.S. money. And all of that, you know, I work for a DuPont company. The DuPont lost the big house they had in Varadero and the 10 kilometers of land. As an individual, they can forget about that. But they lost an entire industry that they had put up there. Those kind of losses were real losses. Yeah, the embargo may have caused some losses also to them. But I'm with Conchita. I like your response. Borrón y cuenta nueva from both sides.
From both sides. You also had, during that same period of time that people do not realize, in Mexico and other Latin American countries, their oil and gas was being nationalized and taken away from U.S. companies. There was some minimal compensation, but you had a very nationalistic movement. You had it in El Peru, you had it in Mexico, where Pemex took from Exxon, from Shell. You know, they keep saying Cuba, but you also have to look at actions that happen in the rest of the Americas that nobody talks to about, and they were nationalized. You had it in Venezuela. PDVSA became government, not government-owned, privately semi-government before Chavez.
Those are good perspectives.
Yeah, I think something else that happens here is, if you, again, going back to 1959, Cuba has given compensation to almost all foreign countries that had property confiscated in Cuba. The U.S. companies are an exception. Part of the reason for the exception is the conflictive situation which existed between the two countries. And Cuba, and I think we're going to see this happen again, that Cuba said, okay, I will tie the compensation into the sugar quotas. And then the U.S. said, and by the way, we're cutting off the sugar quotas. And they said, well, if you cut off the sugar quota, then I don't have the way to pay the money for the compensation, so I'm not denying compensation, you're just not giving me a way that I can pay you. I would not be surprised if Cuba were to say, okay, of the, whatever, $121 billion that's been claimed in the United Nations, as soon as you pay me my $121 billion, I'll be glad to go ahead and compensate DuPont and everybody else at some level. Again, we have somebody uh, Raul, I don't know whether you want to compensate. I mean, comment on this, but you're legalistically, you're incredibly involved in it.
I'm
Well,
very
I don't
involved in it, and you're absolutely right that you have to, go forward. I mean, you can't look back. And it's $120 billion, and these companies, it's at $1.8 billion at the time. And what I've suggested in the past is that Cuba use those claims and that compensation as a means of attracting these companies back. You're going to get something back, you're going to get bonds, you're going to get whatever back, but you invest in Cuba or you propitiate investment by other companies in Cuba. But as you say, it's time to move forward.
Yeah, that's a good
Yes, and how many countries other than the United States tried to invade Cuba and overturn the revolution? And also, if you take a look at some of the other, it may not be completely related, but take a look at what the United States did in Guatemala, in Chile, when other countries tried to nationalize their own products and their own industries, or Iran. So that's a good question I think we need to ask.
Yeah, and obviously we know the answer. I mean, you might say the Dominican Republic tried to do a little bit under Trujillo, but obviously, there was one country that was really involved. There's something kind of anecdotal. When I was sitting up at Harvard last year, I was sitting there with some people who had represented an American company that had been confiscated, and then somebody from the University of Havana. And we had an interesting conversation at lunch where the person who was talking about the company that had been confiscated, I said, well, I have seen that in Cuba they've said that on your tax declarations you said that the company was worth X, but now you're saying it was worth considerably more than that. And he said, well, of course, we didn't necessarily declare everything on our tax declarations. And therefore maybe the company was worth far more than that. That came as not a great surprise. The thing that I found interesting in listening to the professor from Havana was she said that as these cuentapropistas, the people who are having their own businesses, why is it they are concerned about putting their money into Cuban banks, and why is it that they're trying to somehow not show what this cash flow is, simply because they don't want to show to the Cuban government how much money they're making. It's almost like we've gone a complete cycle of, I'm not going to declare what I have because I don't have complete confidence in the government, and guess what, I'm not going to do that again. And that, hopefully somewhere, that pattern changes a little bit.
And also, just before I'll call you, I just want to make a comment that in Cuba, we say here that there are not changes. There are tremendous changes that have taken in Cuba. People can buy and sell their house. People can rent their homes. People are setting up. There are restaurants coming up everywhere. There are sales of automobiles. It might not be what they call them, the almendron, the big old cars, but there are sales. There's limited type of enterprise going on that the government has allowed. And I think in order to keep the population content, they're going to have to keep in mind that the Cuban population is an average of 53 years old. So you have an aging population. You have to retain the young people. And the only way you can retain the young people is by opening up some aspects of economic reforms to them. You had a question, sir.
Yes, thank you. Here in the United States, given freedom of expression, we all know how everybody thinks about Cuba, what they think about Cuba, whether you're a hardline conservative or you're a farmer in Iowa who sells more corn or more chicken to Cuba. But on the other side, in Cuba, we know how the top feels, how the Fidel brothers, their ideology is. My question is this, is from your experiences, from your travels and your dealings with the Cuban government, in the second and third tiers of government, how deeply entrenched is the revolution, the revolutionary ideology?
Let me put it this way. As they say, no es fácil. It is not easy for those tiers. They're surviving. They're trying to make a living. they're trying to resolve, they're trying to put food on the table. A lot of them have under the table some type of black market economy. If they have a family in the US, they might be bringing them nail polish and they might be selling that. So they are trying to survive. I think that that particular group that you're talking about recognizes that the system has failed them, but they also do not want to leave their country. They have their family, they have their parents, and I can understand the love of country. I mean, every time, and I got my daughters that were born here, I got my grandkids, but every time I set foot in Cuba, it's all those memories of everything that was left behind. I mean, I can still picture myself with my cousin playing in El Vedado, in La Azotea. And so, I mean, those memories, the Christmas memories of, setting up the Christmas tree, the roasted pork. I could never figure why we ate pork, black beans, and rice and yuca throughout the whole year, but it was special on Nochebuena, on New Year, and also on New Year's. Those were things that I could never conceive why it was so special in Nochebuena, and then we ate it throughout the whole year. But to answer your question, you have a population and a tier, whether they work for the government or not for the government, that are anxious to bring some type of positive reforms for their families and for themselves.
And I think it may be very, very complicated, just like everything else. Like, what does everybody in the U.S. think about? And all 300 and whatever million of us, that's kind of hard to say. But there's certainly some stratifications in Cuba. You have government officials who have, and not surprisingly, they want to continue to have control of the government. And there's a concern about how much do you open up Pandora's box in relation to greater economic and social freedom before you go too far. And that's one of the conflicts between the U.S. and Cuba, that where we have been promoting telecommunications and Cuba has sort of been saying, well, what do you want? A Cuban Spring to go along with the Arab Spring, which was really successful. And so you see that at one level. At another level, you see some people, this is delicate, but very, very resentful, that they feel great. A group left as gusanos, that they left as people going away, and they came back as mariposas, that they came back as butterflies.
Folks, we have time for a couple more questions.
Oh, okay.
Maria Antonia.
First of all, congratulations for writing the book and publishing the book. I'm very proud of you, Maria Conchita, as a schoolmate of mine for many years back. One of the questions I've had is, how did the Cuban government really pay Tyson all these years for those chickens?
Cash. The best way. On cash. There was no credit, no nothing. You paid cash. You receive your commodity, and before
No letters of credit?
no cash. I mean, who wouldn't want to be paid cash?
If anything went wrong, what kind of rule of law did you have?
And Jay can answer that because they have the service. As a port, we facilitated the trade and we facilitated companies, but I think that the Cuban government, and I'm not talking anything in favor of them, but to their credit, it was very important to them to maintain an image of paying their bills to the U.S. properly and accordingly, as dictated by the law.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
I haven't been following the communications between U.S. and Cuba so closely, but I want to know, it seems like the floodgates have been opened for U.S. to go, but how is Cuba responding to that? Are they fully accepting all of the, the different people coming from the U.S. and maybe establishing businesses there in Cuba and different things like that? Is it in government, are they okay with all that? Or
I think the Cuban government welcomes any tourism. I will give you an advice. We don't know what's going to happen with the upcoming election, who is going to come. As you travel to Cuba, whether tourism or for business, make sure you document on a diary everything you do and everything you spend. There are certain regulations that certain groups can go to Cuba based on those regulations. I would advise anyone to make sure that they document on a daily basis and how much they spend. You have to maintain records for 5 years. You don't want the IRS calling on your door, or you could have the IRS calling and you want to make sure you can present to them all the proper documentation. So if you travel to Cuba and you're going, let's say, on a church group, or you're going to study the architecture of Havana, make sure that you document. I went to this building, I saw this, I stayed this, I spent X on my lunch, I spent X on dinner, I met a pretty Cuban lady, and I took her to see the Morro Castle or something, but you document everything.
You said that you had actually started writing the book 2 to 3 years ago, well before the announcement from the Obama administration. And you said you facilitate business between companies in Cuba, and you ship business between companies in Cuba. Did you think about, or did you tell the Cuban government you were about to write this book? And how did you think about what their what consequences may be, or what they may have thought about the book? At the same time, I know you ship out of Jacksonville, which is part of Florida, and you've got the South Florida contingent, and other businesses that you do business with. So you're sort of on both sides of the fence. In the middle, what were your thoughts when you said, we're going to put this down in writing, we're going to publish this book?
I think the first thing that we did was that we said, okay, we have to be really transparent with everybody involved. Maria was talking about transparency, and we mentioned to U.S. officials and we mentioned to Cuban officials that we were interested in doing this. We talked about what our concept and approach was. We didn't ask for permission, and we didn't ask for censorship, but we did express, this is what we're doing, these are the kinds of things we're going to be talking about. So I think that nobody felt betrayed. We didn't become the meat in the sandwich on this one, that they understood what we were doing, where we were going, and it goes back and underlines what Mari said, that transparency is so important. You can do a lot of things if people understand what your motivation and why you're doing it. And the motivation for this was really important. It was to build bridges to make things better. It wasn't to try to somehow attack somebody to make somebody look worse.
And what was funny was, from the Cuban side, when we went to Cuba, they would ask us, how's the book coming? What chapter what are you writing about? They never told us to change anything. And then from the U.S. side, many times you met with the State Department. We had unfriendly and friendly guests knocked at our door, and I leave it at that. And they would ask us what we were writing about. And if you look at what Obama said about the businesses, I laughed because I called Jay and I said, Jay, he must have read our book. I mean, he's quoting us directly from the book. But yeah.
I congratulate you too on publishing this.
Thank you. I think we're getting close to the end.
Good, thank you very much.
All right, folks, so if there are no more questions, then we have Cuba It Matters for sale at the counter in the front room over there. Maria Conchita and Jay are going to be signing at the table over there to the right of these stools. And we also have a lovely reception set up in the back over there in the corner. So buy a book, get it signed, have a glass of wine, and please let's have another hand for Maria Conchita Mendez and Jay Brickman. Thank you very much.